Hello, welcome back to the Cipher Brief Digital Studio. I'm editor-writer Ethan Masukal. Today we're going to be talking about the recent US-Iran talks that happened in Oman. And here to talk about that with me is Alex Vitanka. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
So Alex, I just want to start off. What was your reaction to these recent talks in Oman? They've been described as productive, constructive by both sides. Language that is somewhat surprising, one might say, for engagement between the U.S. and Iran. So, what is your reaction so far?
Yeah, Ethan, as you said, so far both sides have come out, both in Washington and in Tehran, and described the four rounds of exchanges of messages that apparently happened over the course of 2.5 hours in Muscat, the capital of Oman, as constructive. We have to wait and see what that means, because obviously you need an agreement to be able to justify such a sort of euphoria and a positive early feedback. But to answer your question, my kind of big test in terms of whether these talks would be fruitful or not early on was whether there was going to be a new round of talks happening.
Mhm.
And very early on, while the two parties were still on the ground in Oman, both sides said there would be more talks happening. So from that sort of optic, it was a success.
Okay, I see. And sort of taking a step back here, what are the goals that both sides are approaching these talks with? Of course, they were focusing on Iran's nuclear program, but what are both sides looking for in these engagements?
I think that remains to be figured out, frankly. But in terms of the bottom line, neither United States nor Iran is interested in letting these tensions surrounding Iran's nuclear program blow up in the shape of a military conflict. That is the last thing President Trump wants to see. As a politician, his entire career has been one of warning against these open-ended, costly wars in the Middle East.
Mhm.
So for him to sort of end up in one of those wars would be essentially a personal and a political failure. So I think he's very reluctant to take action against Iran militarily. And yet, as he has put it, he does not want to see an Iranian nuclear weapon. So
Right.
that's his red line. The Iranians do not want to see the United States Air Force flying over Iran's skies and hitting massive amounts of targets, because that would set not just their economy at risk, but it's really the survival of the regime could be put at risk. So the
Right.
bottom line is neither side wants conflict. Now we have to wait and see these rounds, and I'm sure there'll be multiple rounds of talks to happen if that's going to enable the path for diplomacy to sort of emerge.
Right. Do you see a pathway to a deal? Because, as you said, both sides don't want conflict, and that's why they're talking
Yeah.
right now. But, there's this administration, there's been rhetoric and signals of a willingness to use military force if needed, and Iran is still continuing, nuclear enrichment. So, do you see a pathway to a deal?
I do see a pathway. Look, let me just tackle the issue of the use of force, because there's so much in the news about United States deploying military assets like the B-2s and so on to the region,
Right.
and that this is supposed to be a game changer, that we're sort of on the edge of a conflict. We have to remember Iran's nuclear program was sort of revealed to the world back in 2002. And throughout that period, there has been multiple rounds of the world, being on the brink of war between US and Iran. And it almost happens the same way. US puts troops closer to Iran, Iran threatens to weaponize his nuclear program, and then nothing happens. So those of us who are hopeful, those of us who really think a new war in the Middle East would be to the detriment to international security, we have to sort of take a step back. The question of diplomacy working or not, to my mind, it's really about expectations. If President Trump, and I think he single-handedly pretty much shapes U.S. position on this. So I would not be looking to folks like Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz and others to shape his mindset on this issue. It's one man and his envoy, Stephen Witkoff, who are essentially the ones that matter. His bottom line, President Trump's bottom line, is no Iranian nuclear weapon. On the Iranian side, you have a supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has come out and said he doesn't want to have a nuclear weapon, but he doesn't want to give up the civilian nuclear program. If that's the case, both of them agree there shouldn't be an Iranian nuclear weapon. So the question is, how do you monitor Iran's nuclear civilian program. And we already have a template. It goes back to 2015. Most of the heavy lifting was done 10 years ago. Now, of course, we know Iran's program is very different today. It's expanded massively, but the same template in terms of rolling it back exists. It's a question of reducing the number of centrifuges, Iran enriching no more than a certain percentage, and so forth. So it's doable if it's limited to only the nuclear issue. That's the big question. Will the US ask for other concessions from Iran? Will the Iranians ask for something different than they did in 2015? If that's the case, would it complicate talks or not? We have to wait and see.
The future of national security is here. Introducing the Cipher Brief's NatSec Edge Conference, June 5th through 6th, 2025 in Austin, Texas. Join leaders from intelligence, defense, private industry, and investment as they explore the innovations shaping tomorrow's world. Gain critical insights, connect with top minds, and shape the future of security in an interconnected world. Don't just witness the future, be a part of it. Secure your spot now at natsekedge.com.
Getting a bit to the timing of these talks, so as you mentioned, there's the element of the second Trump administration coming in. But the one I want to ask you about is, experts have told the Cipher Brief this is a relative moment of weakness for Iran. Hamas and Hezbollah have been degraded, and Iran demonstrated that it has gaps in its air and missile defense from Israeli attacks last year. But I want to quote you actually, from something that you said to The Guardian recently. Quote, Iran has been weakened in the region, no doubt about it, but they still claim to be the leading proponents of the Islamic cause who stand up to Western bullying. So what might work with countries in Europe or in Latin America will not necessarily work with the Iranian regime. So can you explain what you mean by that? Because it seems that you agree this is a moment of weakness for Iran, but you might not be pushing like other experts saying this is the moment to get to push them for a deal.
So no, I do agree that Iran is on the defensive. In fact, let me just quote Iranian officials who are saying, you know what's different about 2025 and 2015 when Iran last reached a nuclear deal? In 2015, Iran's ultimate sort of demand and hope was to get sanctions lifted. What is the big demand of 2025? It's to avoid war. They're very different. Sanctions relief is what you hope for. War is what you're desperately trying to avoid. So yes, Iran from that point of view is on the defensive. But I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., and there are folks who are writing commentary after commentary saying Iran is on the defensive, therefore you should ask for example, the Libya model, meaning Iran gives up its entire nuclear program. Or you ask that Iran publicly comes out and denounces all its past support for Hezbollah or the Houthis and so forth. That's where I sort of say, well, listen, yes, they're weak, but if you're asking for outright capitulation, for them to come out in public with the white flag and say, we're sorry, we've been wrong for the last half a century, that's not going to happen. That's how you end up in a war situation. So I think, what would be realistic is for the United States to accept that for the longest of time, U.S. has had lots of problems with this Iranian regime. But the most important one, it's that nuclear weapon question. Focus on that and recognize this regime's biggest enemy is not the U.S. Air Force. It's not the B-2s that are sitting in the Indian Ocean. It's that angry Iranian public opinion that essentially, frankly, hates the regime for everything it stands for. So you could play a different game. You could focus on the short term, what the U.S. needs to do, roll back the nuclear program, and look for creative ways of helping an Iranian people that essentially want to get rid of an Islamist regime that has lost its legitimacy a long time ago, and turn Iran into a country that could choose a different path and maybe even move closer to the United States, and do so without the U.S. being dragged into a open-ended and potentially very costly war.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you raised as well that you think the talks right now should focus on the nuclear program, so more so than other issues. I just want to pick your brain a bit about how the Houthis factor into this, because the U.S. has ramped up its campaign against that group. Do you see that being a pitfall if that gets raised in the talks?
So Ethan, I would say the process is extremely important. and people like myself who watch Iran more than anything else, if we were asked by the Trump White House what to watch out for, is you can get a lot more out of this Iranian regime if you don't publicly humiliate them. Give them a quiet way to step down. The Iranians today recognize, by and large, that their regional agenda and the use of the proxies at this moment has become a liability for Iran. It might have been an asset back in the day, but the last year and a half, post October 7th, what Israel's managed to do against Hezbollah, Hamas, and so on, the fall of Assad in Syria last year, the Iranians really have no case to make anymore in terms of why it's so good to be in the region and use proxies. They're saying publicly in that Iranian debate back in Iran, we need to rethink this. But they are really hard pressed to kind of publicly come out and admit it. Certainly not the supreme leader or the generals in the Revolutionary Guards. That's where you essentially have to have two tracks or multiple tracks. One is the public diplomatic track. You deal with the nuclear issue. There'll be an agreement. Photographers will take pictures. In best case scenario, U.S. embassy in downtown Tehran will reopen. That would be a win, public win. Quietly, you get the U.S. intelligence community to work with the Iranian side and say, look, your supply of missiles to the Houthis, you don't have to come out publicly denounce the Houthis. All we want to see is materially that flow of weapons stops. Right? That's good enough for the United States. U.S. shouldn't take the success to be an public admission by Tehran that denounced the Houthis, because that's going to put them in a very bad place, awkward place. But the measure of success should be that the Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandeb comes to an end. If Iran can pull it off, because again, separate issue, but we shouldn't assume here that the Iranians control the Houthis. The Houthis get parts for the missiles from the Chinese, from Russians. They make some of it at home in Yemen. So Iran isn't necessarily the one factor here that matters. But from an Iranian point of view, my fundamental point is this. They need to, and they're kind of in that direction, choose their national interest above anything they do in the region, because what they do in the region is not about Iranian national interest. It's more ideologically driven, and Iran can get rid of it without Iranians being upset or with the world necessarily coming to miss it, because the world would much rather see an Iran focused on Iranian national interest, open for business, as opposed to an Iran that is out there in the region, pursuing these ideological campaigns like the fight against Israel, support of Hezbollah, and so on.
Right. Complex diplomatic issue, to say the least. Alex, last question to you. What are you going to be looking forward? What are you going to be looking at in the next few weeks? There's a second round of talks to be happening this week, and then even going forward in the months ahead, what are you looking for? Spoilers for a possible deal, things that might push a deal to be more likely. Look into your crystal ball a bit.
Oh, Ethan, I think that is absolutely the most important question here. And I would, again, not because I focus on Iran, but I really actually think this so much of this depends on the regime in Tehran's leadership to make a final decision to turn the page and go into a different direction of the question of the United States. The one lesson we learned from the 2015 nuclear deal is a nuclear agreement between Washington and Tehran alone is not going to fix the bad blood going back to 1979. So as early on, as broadly as possible, Iran needs to open itself up for talks with the Trump administration. And here is an American president who is reluctant to go to war in the Middle East, who has basically no grand strategy. He's not going to focus on regime change. So the Iranian leadership, whether it's good or bad, let others judge, but President Trump is not a regime change kind of a character. So the Iranian authorities back in Tehran have a moment here to turn the page and broaden the conversation with the United States, talk about other issues that U.S. care about, because if they do that, then the probability that any new nuclear agreement can survive, unlike the 2015 one, will be that much greater. And by the way, I think the Iranian leaders would tell you, if you're interviewing them right now, they will tell you one of the problems they have is strategic loneliness. Iran doesn't have any friends. There's a lot of talk about Russia and China and North Korea. End of the day, Iran is on its own, and they know it. If there is war, nobody in the world is going to go to Iran's aid. So they have a moment here where they need to figure things out in the United States, not for the sake of making Donald Trump happy, but for the sake of their own national interest.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for sharing your insights, and we will be speaking more as these talks go on.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Ethan.